The desert looked like a graveyard God had forgotten. Wind dragged long ribbons of dust across the Arizona frontier, swallowing old wagon tracks beneath a burning afternoon sky. Heat rose from the cracked earth in trembling waves, turning the horizon into a mirage of ghosts and smoke. Somewhere far away, a lonely eagle circled above the wasteland, its cry disappearing into the silence. And in the middle of that silence stood a dying little house. If you're new here, subscribe to the channel and tap the bell icon. Stories like this deserve to be remembered. The shack leaned sideways against the desert wind as though exhaustion alone kept it standing. Its wooden walls were faded gray from years of sun and sandstorms. One shutter hung loose. The roof carried patches of old canvas where rain had once broken through. Inside, the smell of dust, sweat, and stale bread clung to the air. Elena Morales sat quietly beside the small iron stove, sewing a tear in her daughter's dress beneath weak daylight leaking through the cracks in the wall. Her fingers moved carefully despite the tremble in her hands. Hunger had made her slower these days. Across from her, little Mateo sat on the floor with his back against the wall, trying not to stare at the empty cooking pot beside the stove. At only 8 years old, his face already carried the sharpness of hardship. Sophia, younger by 3 years, slept beside him with her head resting against his shoulder. The girl's stomach growled softly in her sleep. Elena lowered her eyes. Outside, the wind howled again. For 3 years, the drought had strangled the land around Red Hollow. Wells dried into mud, crops vanished beneath dust storms. Men with money survived. Men without it disappeared into shallow graves beneath the desert sand. And women like Elena learned how long pride could survive starvation. She rose slowly and crossed the room barefoot, her faded dress brushing against the wooden floorboards. From a small cloth sock hidden beneath the cabinet, she removed the last piece of stale bread. Tiny, hard as stone. Still, she broke it carefully into 2 pieces. Mateo looked up immediately. "Mama." "You eat," Elena whispered gently. "What about you?" "I already did." It was a lie. The same lie she told every night. Mateo understood anyway. The boy lowered his eyes and accepted the bread without another word. Elena turned away before her children could see the tears gathering in her eyes. Years ago, people in Red Hollow used to say Elena Morales was the most beautiful woman south of the Colorado River. Men once fought over dances just to hold her hand for a few minutes beneath lantern light. Now, those same people crossed the street when they saw her. Mexican blood made a person disposable in places like Red Hollow, especially after she married a white lawman, especially after he disappeared. The wind outside suddenly shifted. Then came the sound. Horse hooves, slow, heavy, approaching from the western flats. Mateo stood quickly and moved toward the window. "Someone's coming." Elena froze. Visitors never came here. Not anymore. She stepped outside carefully, shielding her eyes against the blazing sun. At first, all she saw was dust. Then the rider appeared through the heat shimmer. Tall, broad-shouldered, a long weather-beaten coat hanging behind the saddle, a silver Texas Ranger badge glinting beneath sunlight. The horse moved steadily toward the shock while leather saddlebags swung at its sides. Tied carefully behind the saddle sat a wooden crate filled with supplies, and balanced in the rider's hand was a small metal tray carrying fruit. Real fruit. Apples, oranges, fresh. Elena's breath caught inside her chest. The rider finally stopped several feet away. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The wind carried dust between them like smoke from an old battlefield. Then the man slowly lifted his eyes, and Elena Morales felt her heart stop. Caleb Mercer. Older now. Harder. A scar cut across the edge of his jaw beneath several days of beard. His eyes looked darker than she remembered, worn down by things a man carried too long alone. But it was him. The same man who once held her beneath desert stars. The same man who vanished without goodbye. The father of her children. Mateo stepped out beside Elena carefully. Sophia appeared in the doorway, rubbing sleep from her eyes. Neither child understood why their mother suddenly looked like she'd seen a ghost. Caleb's gaze moved toward the children for only a second before returning to Elena. Pain flickered across his face so quickly it almost disappeared. "Elena," he said quietly. His voice sounded rough, rested by years of silence. Elena said nothing. The desert wind moved between them again. Caleb slowly climbed down from his horse and approached with caution, as though he feared one wrong movement might shatter something already broken. "I heard things were bad out here," he said. Elena's jaw tightened. "You heard?" she asked coldly. "After 4 years?" Caleb lowered his eyes briefly. The words struck exactly where they were meant to. Mateo stared between them in confusion. Sophia hid partially behind Elena's dress. Caleb swallowed hard before holding out the metal tray carefully. "I brought food." Elena looked at the fruit without moving. Bright oranges, red apples, enough food to make the children smile again. For one dangerous second, her pride almost refused it. Then Sophia whispered softly behind her, "Mama." That single word broke whatever strength remained. Elena stepped aside silently. Caleb entered the shack slowly, removing his hat as though stepping into a church. His eyes moved across the room carefully. The empty shelves, the patched blankets, the dry water bucket, the tiny shoes near the stove with holes worn through the bottoms. Every detail carved guilt deeper into his face. Mateo stared at the ranger badge on Caleb's coat. "Are you a soldier?" Caleb looked at the boy for a long moment before answering. "Something like that." He crouched carefully and handed Sophia an orange. The little girl stared at it like treasure. "When's the last time you had fruit?" Caleb asked softly. Sophia looked toward her mother before answering. "I don't remember." Something inside Caleb visibly broke. Elena saw it happen, and part of her hated herself because seeing his pain still hurt her too. The children ate slowly while silence filled the room. Only the sound of wind against the walls remained. Finally, Elena spoke. "You shouldn't have come here." Caleb looked toward her. "I know." "Then why did you?" He struggled to answer. Because no honest answer could survive what stood between them. Because he had left her alone. Because the world had punished her for loving him. Because every night for 4 years he remembered her face. Caleb looked down at his weathered hands. "I was passing through Red Hollow," he said quietly. "Heard rumors about a widow and 2 children starving out in the flats." Elena's eyes hardened immediately. "A widow." Caleb closed his eyes briefly. The word cut deeper than any knife. Outside, thunder rumbled faintly beyond distant mountains, though the sky remained dry and empty. Elena crossed her arms tightly. "You don't get to walk back into our lives because guilt finally found you." "Our lives." The words lingered heavily between them. Caleb looked toward Mateo and Sophia again. This time Elena noticed something dangerous in his expression. Love. Pure and painful. The kind a man tries desperately to hide. But children always recognize kindness faster than adults do. Mateo stepped closer to Caleb carefully. "Did you bring all this by yourself?" Caleb nodded once. "That's a long ride." "It was." Mateo smiled faintly for the first time in weeks, and Elena suddenly realized something terrifying. Her children already trusted him. The sun slowly lowered outside, turning the desert gold beneath drifting dust clouds. Caleb finally stood. "I'll leave the supplies," he said quietly. "There's water in the second crate. Dried meat, too." Elena remained silent. Caleb placed his hat back on slowly and walked toward the door. For one brief second, he stopped beside her, close enough for her to remember the warmth of him, close enough to remember another lifetime. "I never stopped looking for a way back," he whispered. Then he walked outside. Elena stood frozen in the doorway as Caleb climbed onto his horse beneath the burning evening sky. Eagles circled high above the desert. Far across the empty horizon, a small line of camels moved slowly beside distant traders crossing the frontier trail like shadows against the setting sun. Caleb glanced back one final time, not like a lawman, not like a stranger, like a man staring at the ruins of the only home he ever loved. Then he rode away into the dust, and Elena Morales realized the hardest part was not surviving without him. It was surviving the part of her heart that still remembered his name. By nightfall, Red Hollow looked less like a town and more like a wound carved into the desert. Lantern light bled through saloon windows while drunken voices drifted into the hot Arizona wind. Horses stood tied outside gambling houses beneath clouds of dust and cigar smoke. Somewhere deeper in town, a piano played badly through laughter that sounded meaner than joy. And above it all hung the smell of whiskey, sweat, gunpowder, and corruption. If you're new here, subscribe to the channel and tap the bell icon. Stories like this deserve to be remembered. Caleb Mercer rode slowly down the main street beneath the glow of oil lamps. His horse moved carefully across the muddy patches left behind by the public well, though most of the town remained dry as bone. Men looked up when they saw him. Some recognized the Silver Ranger badge. Others recognized the man wearing it. Neither brought comfort. A group of former Confederate mercenaries leaned against the saloon porch, smoking cigars beneath faded military coats. One of them spat into the dirt when Caleb passed. "Well," the man muttered darkly, "look what the desert dragged back." Another laughed quietly. "The Mexican lover." Caleb kept writing. Years ago, those same men had nearly beaten him unconscious outside this very street for marrying Elena Morales. Red Hollow tolerated violence easier than it tolerated love crossing racial lines. The memory still lived in the town like old poison. At the far end of the street stood the Broken Spur Saloon, a crooked building with cracked windows and swinging doors stained dark from years of dust storms. Caleb climbed down from his horse and stepped inside. Heat wrapped around him immediately. Cigar smoke floated beneath lantern light while card players crowded around gambling tables. A weary piano player pressed crooked fingers against yellowed keys. Women in tired dresses carried whiskey bottles between miners and cattle drivers. But the loudest sound in the room was silence, because Caleb Mercer had just walked in. Eyes followed him everywhere. He ignored them and approached the bar. The bartender, an older man named Walter Finch, stopped polishing a glass when he recognized him. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Walter sighed heavily. "Thought you died." "Almost did." Walter poured whiskey into a chipped glass and slid it across the counter without asking. Caleb didn't touch it. "I'm looking for information," he said quietly. Walter's expression darkened immediately. "That woman still alive out there?" Caleb's jaw tightened. "She has a name." Walter lowered his voice, then stopped saying it too loudly around here. The saloon noise continued around them while tension settled like dust between old memories. Caleb leaned closer. "What happened to her ranch?" Walter looked toward the gamblers before answering carefully. "Debt happened. That ranch was paid off. Not after the drought." Caleb remained silent. Walter rubbed his tired eyes before continuing. 3 bad harvests. Water dried up. Then came Silas Boone with contracts and loans. Folks signed papers they couldn't read because starvation don't leave a man many choices. And Boone took the land. Walter nodded slowly. He took half the valley. Caleb finally lifted the whiskey glass but didn't drink. "What about Elena?" The bartender hesitated. "Too long," Caleb noticed immediately. "What?" Walter looked uncomfortable now. "She owes Boone money." "How much?" "Enough." Caleb's stare hardened. "Say it." Walter leaned closer over the counter. "You really don't know what kind of town this became while you were gone?" Outside, thunder rolled faintly beyond distant mountains. Walter lowered his voice further. "Boone runs debt settlements now." Caleb frowned. "What does that mean?" The old bartender looked ashamed even speaking the words. "It means poor folks sell years of labor to clear what they owe. Sometimes ranch hands, sometimes widows." Something cold moved through Caleb's chest. "No." Walter didn't answer. The silence told him enough. Caleb slowly set the whiskey glass down untouched. His voice became dangerous. "You saying Boone buys people? He calls it lawful contracts. That ain't law." Walter gave a bitter laugh. "In Red Hollow, it is." The piano music suddenly sounded far away. Caleb's mind drifted back to Elena's face inside that broken shack. The empty shelves, the hungry children, the quiet pride she still carried despite everything. And suddenly he understood. Dear God, she had been preparing herself for something. Walter spoke softly. "There's another auction tomorrow." Caleb looked up instantly. "Who?" Walter swallowed hard. "She signed her name yesterday." For several seconds, Caleb
Move. Did not breathe. The saloon noise faded into distant echoes while rage rose slowly behind his eyes. "No. She's doing it for the children." Caleb slammed the whiskey glass against the counter hard enough to crack it. Several men turned immediately. Walter grabbed his arm quickly. "Keep your voice down." But Caleb was already stepping away from the bar. The saloon doors burst open as he stormed back into the night. Wind whipped dust across the empty street beneath the darkening sky. Somewhere nearby, church bells rang slowly through the town. Caleb walked toward Boone's office with murder in his chest. But halfway there, he stopped. Across the street stood Elena. She carried a small sack of flour beneath one arm while Sophia held her hand beside her. Mateo walked quietly behind them carrying water. The sight alone nearly shattered him. Elena looked exhausted beneath the lantern glow, but her spine remained straight. Pride still lived inside her, despite the cruelty surrounding her. Then came the voices. 2 wealthy cattlemen standing outside the barber shop noticed her passing. "One of Boone's girls now," one muttered. The other smirked cruelly. Guess Mercer's Mexican widow finally learned her place. Mateo heard them. Caleb saw it in the boy's face immediately. Shame, confusion, pain too old for a child. Elena heard them too, but she never stopped walking, never lowered her head, never gave them the satisfaction. She simply tightened her grip on Sophia's hand and kept moving through the dust, like a woman refusing to let the world see her bleed. Caleb watched silently from the shadows, and for the first time in years, he truly understood what she had survived without him. Not just hunger, humiliation, isolation, cruelty, every single day. Elena suddenly stopped near the edge of town. Slowly she turned. She had sensed him there all along. Their eyes met across the empty street while lantern light flickered against drifting dust. Caleb stepped forward carefully. "Elena, you shouldn't be here." Her voice carried exhaustion more than anger now. "I know about Boone." Her face changed instantly, a flash of fear, then fury. "Who told you?" "That don't matter. It matters to me." Mateo and Sophia looked between them silently. Elena knelt beside the children and touched their faces gently. "Go wait near the well." "Mama, please." The children obeyed reluctantly. Once they were gone, Elena faced Caleb fully beneath the cold desert wind. "You had no right." "No right?" Caleb whispered in disbelief. "You were going to sell yourself to that animal. I was going to feed my children." The words struck harder than a bullet. Caleb stared at her helplessly. "Elena, you think pride fills empty stomachs?" Her voice cracked for the first time. Barely, but enough. The wind lifted strands of dark hair across her tired face while tears threatened her eyes. Still, she refused to let them fall. "I buried horses with my bare hands during the drought," she whispered. "I watched men spit at my children because of their blood. I begged Banks for more time while Boone waited like a vulture outside my ranch." Caleb lowered his eyes. Every word felt deserved. "I searched for you," he said quietly. Elena laughed bitterly. "No, you searched for forgiveness." The truth silenced him. Lantern light flickered across the street while distant thunder rolled again above the mountains. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Elena looked toward her children near the well. "When people are starving," she said softly, "they stop belonging to themselves." Caleb felt something break inside him hearing that, because she believed it now, believed her own life had become a thing to barter for survival. And the worst part of the world agreed. Caleb stepped closer carefully. "You still got a choice." Elena looked at him with quiet heartbreak. "No," she whispered. "I lost that years ago." The words lingered between them like smoke from an old fire. Then she turned away before he could answer. Mateo grabbed her hand again. Sophia leaned sleepily against her side, and together they walked slowly through the dust toward the dark desert beyond town. Caleb remained standing alone beneath the lantern light long after they disappeared. Wind moved through Red Hollow's empty streets. Somewhere in the distance, coyotes cried beyond the hills, and high above the frontier sky, an eagle circled beneath gathering storm clouds. While Caleb Mercer finally realized something terrible. The law he served had protected men like Boone. The badge on his chest
had never saved the woman he loved. It had only watched her suffer. That night, the town of Red Hollow slept beneath distant thunder. But Caleb Mercer did not sleep, because for the first time in years, vengeance no longer felt like violence. It felt like justice. That was my story. If it reached you, tell me what you felt. Don't let silence bury us again. Drop your thoughts in the comments and tell me where in the world you're listening from. The sun above Red Hollow burned like judgment. By noon, the center of town had become a theater of humiliation. Dust swirled beneath wagon wheels while drunken gamblers shouted beside wooden platforms built for debt auctions. Horses kicked against hitching posts, whiskey bottles rolled through the dirt. Men laughed too loudly beneath the desert heat, pretending cruelty was entertainment. And in the middle of it all stood Elena Morales. The wind lifted the edges of her faded brown dress while the entire town watched her in silence. She stood straight anyway, not proud, not broken, something far more dangerous, a woman enduring. The church bell rang once somewhere in the distance, slow and hollow against the burning sky. Near the back of the crowd, Caleb Mercer sat motionless on horseback beneath the shade of an old stable roof. His silver ranger badge remained hidden beneath his coat. Dust coated his boots, his jaw stayed tight enough to crack bone. He had seen battlefields before, burned cavalry camps, bodies floating beside rivers after border raids, children crying beside smoke and blood. But somehow this felt worse, because Elena stood alone, and because part of this suffering belonged to him. Near the platform, Mateo gripped his mother's hand tightly while Sophia held onto her dress with frightened little fingers. "Mama," Sophia whispered softly, "why are all these people staring?" Elena knelt carefully before her daughter. The little girl's cheeks were pale from hunger. Wind moved strands of dark hair across her frightened eyes. Elena touched her face gently. "It'll be over soon." But even she no longer believed that. Matteo looked around the crowd uneasily. He was old enough to understand shame, even if he did not yet understand the shape of it. Some men stared at Elena with pity, others with hunger. Both made Caleb sick. Then came the sound of boots against wooden boards. Silas Boone climbed onto the auction platform beneath the blazing Arizona sun. Tall, heavy, a white linen suit stretched across his thick body while a gold watch chain glimmered against his chest. His beard was neatly trimmed, his boots polished black. Everything about him looked expensive, except his eyes. Those looked dead. Boone raised one hand toward the crowd. "Well now," he called loudly, "looks like half the territory came thirsty for business." Laughter scattered through the square. Caleb's hands slowly tightened near his revolver. Boone unfolded a paper dramatically. "Miss Elena Morales," he announced, "outstanding debt holder under territorial recovery law." Elena lowered her eyes briefly, not from weakness, from surviving too long. Boone continued walking across the platform like a preacher delivering scripture. 3 years unpaid water loans, livestock losses, land taxes, interest accumulation. He smiled coldly toward the crowd. "Funny thing about debt, it always gets paid one way or another." More laughter. Matteo looked up at his mother in confusion. What's he talking about? Elena swallowed hard before answering. "Nothing you need to worry about. But children always hear fear hiding inside adult voices." Sophia suddenly wrapped both arms around Elena's waist. "I want to go home." Those words nearly destroyed Caleb. Across the square, a drunk rancher shouted, "She worth less every year, Boone." Another voice laughed. "Depends how desperate a man gets." Boone grinned at the crowd while Elena stood frozen beneath the humiliation. Yet somehow she still refused to cry. That strength hurt Caleb more than tears ever could, because he remembered another version of her. Years earlier, before drought, before hatred hollowed her eyes, before survival became punishment. The memory arrived suddenly. A younger Elena, standing beside a desert chapel wearing white cotton beneath lantern light, wind blowing through mesquite trees, her laughter soft beneath music drifting from an old violin. Caleb remembering how nervous his hands felt while sliding a simple silver ring onto her finger. "You sure you want a ranger?" he had whispered then. Elena smiled. "No," she answered. Then she kissed him anyway. The memory shattered beneath the sound of Boone's voice. "Now then," Boone announced loudly, "Miss Morales has agreed to contract labor settlement in exchange for full debt removal." The crowd shifted closer. Caleb felt rage rising slowly inside his chest. He remembered another memory now. Elena screaming during Sophia's birth while rain hammered their ranch roof, her hand crushing his fingers. The moment she finally held their daughter against her chest while tears ran down her exhausted face. "You see," she whispered then, "even storms bring something beautiful." Caleb closed his eyes.
Dear God, how had it all ended here? Boone stepped closer to Elena. "Raise your chin," he ordered quietly. Elena did not move. Boone clapped her jaw roughly. And that was the moment something inside Caleb finally broke. Because another memory returned. Smoke, gunfire, border violence near the Sonoran trails years earlier. Caleb being dragged away by cavalry officers after refusing illegal orders against Mexican settlements accused of aiding outlaws. Elena crying while soldiers held her back. Caleb promising he would return before disappearing into war, prison transports, and bloodshed across territories that forgot his name. He had survived every mile trying to come home. Too late. Boone looked across the crowd. "Bidding begins at 200. Caleb stepped forward instantly. "Stop." The single word silenced the town. Dust moved slowly across the square while every eye turned toward him. Boone narrowed his eyes. "Well," he muttered, the ranger finally found his courage. Caleb walked through the crowd without looking away from Elena. People moved aside automatically, not from respect, from the violence they sensed coming. Elena stared at him in disbelief. "No," she whispered. But Caleb kept walking. His boots struck the dirt heavily beneath the burning sun. Then he stopped directly in front of the platform. For one long moment, he looked only at Elena, and she saw it immediately, the decision already made. Caleb slowly removed a worn leather bag from beneath his coat, heavy, dust-covered, everything he still owned in this world.
Boone smirked faintly. You planning to gamble, Ranger? Caleb threw the bag onto the platform. Coins exploded across the wood beneath sunlight. The crowd gasped. Then Caleb placed something else beside it, his official Ranger pension papers, then his horse steed, then his silver watch, then finally, his revolver belt. The entire square fell silent. Even the wind seemed to stop moving. Boone stared downward carefully now. Caleb's voice came low and steady. That covers every dollar she owes. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Elena looked at the pile in horror. Caleb. But he never looked away from Boone. You touch her contract again, Caleb said quietly, and I'll bury you so deep this desert forgets your name. The threat carried no anger. That made it worse. Boone slowly crouched beside the pile, checking the documents one by one. The town watched in absolute silence. Finally, Boone stood again. A smile crept slowly across his face. Well, he muttered, looks like love makes fools of men after all. Caleb didn't answer. Boone handed Elena's contract toward him lazily. Dead cleared. Caleb grabbed it immediately. Then Boone leaned closer, quiet enough for only Caleb to hear. You just made enemies richer than me. Caleb's eyes darkened. I already had them. Boone smiled wider. Yes, he whispered, but now they'll come for her too. The tension lingered heavily between them before Caleb finally turned toward Elena and immediately realized this was not salvation, not to her. Elena's face burned with humiliation, pain, fury. Tears finally stood in her eyes, but not from weakness, from wounded pride. You had no right, she whispered. Caleb looked stunned. I was trying to help you. You think throwing money at me fixes this? The crowd still watched. Every word cut deeper because strangers were listening. Elena stepped closer, voice trembling now. I survived without you. I know. No, she snapped softly. You don't. Mateo and Sophia stood frozen nearby, confused and frightened. Caleb looked toward them briefly before lowering his voice. I couldn't let them take you. Elena's eyes filled completely now. And I never wanted your pity. Those words hit harder than Boone's insults ever could, because Caleb understood something terrible in that moment. She would rather starve with dignity than survive feeling owned again, even by him. The wind rose suddenly across Red Hollow. Dust spiraled through the empty street while thunder gathered beyond distant cliffs. For several seconds they simply stood there staring at each other beneath the burning sun. Not strangers, not lovers, something far more painful. Two people who still carried the ruins of the same life. Finally, Elena looked my first. She reached for Mateo and Sophia silently. The children clung to her immediately. Caleb watched her carefully as she walked away from the auction square. The crowd parted around her in silence now. No laughter remained, only shame. Because even the cruelest people in Red Hollow had witnessed something sacred die beneath that desert sun. Far above the frontier, eagles suckled slowly to
gathering storm clouds while the wind carried dust across the empty road behind Elena Morales. And Caleb Mercer stood alone in the middle of town, with nothing left except the woman he still loved, and the certainty that saving her would cost far more than money ever could. Night settled over the Arizona desert like a slow funeral. The wind had gone quiet. Only the crackling of firewood and the distant cry of coyotes moved through the darkness surrounding Elena Morales' small shack. Above the empty frontier sky, stars burned cold and endless over the dry land. And somewhere far beyond the hills, unseen riders were already searching for blood. Caleb Mercer sat beside the fire with a rifle resting across his lap. His horse stood tied near the water barrel, while shadows from the flames moved across his weathered face. The silver Ranger badge was gone now, hidden beneath his saddlebag as though even he no longer trusted what it represented. Inside the shack, Sophia slept beneath patched blankets, while Mateo pretended not to watch Caleb through the doorway. Elena stood near the stove, quietly washing dishes in silence. Everything between them felt unfinished, not broken completely, just buried beneath too many years. The fire outside snapped loudly. Mateo finally stepped onto the porch carrying 2 tin cups carefully. Coffee, the boy said softly. Caleb looked surprised. You made this? Mateo nodded proudly. Mama showed me. Caleb accepted the cup slowly. Thank you. The boy sat nearby without speaking for several moments.
Wind moved softly through the dry grass around the shock while desert darkness stretched endlessly behind them. Finally, Mateo looked toward him. You really were a ranger? Caleb stared into the fire. Still am, I suppose. You ever kill anybody? The question came innocent and honest, the way only children ask terrible things. Caleb answered after a long silence. Yes. Mateo looked down at the dirt. Did it bother you? The firelight reflected in Caleb's eyes now. Every time. The boy nodded quietly, as though trying to understand what kind of man sat beside him. Then Mateo glanced toward the old cavalry rifle leaning near the porch wall. Mama says you can shoot a coin off a fence post. A faint smile almost touched Caleb's face. Your mama talks too much. That earned the smallest laugh from the boy. Inside the house, Elena heard it, and for a brief painful moment the sound reminded her of another life. A younger Caleb laughing beside their ranch fence years ago, while Mateo sat on his shoulders, barely old enough to walk. Warm sunlight, horses grazing beyond tall grass, Sophia still a baby, sleeping against Elena's chest, while Caleb promised the drought would pass soon, back when hope still lived there. Elena closed her eyes tightly. The memory hurt too much. Outside, Mateo looked toward Caleb carefully again. Why'd you leave? The question struck harder than any bullet ever had. Inside the shock, Elena stopped breathing. Caleb stared into the fire for several seconds before answering. I didn't mean to. Mateo frowned slightly. Mama says men always mean to. Caleb looked toward the boy slowly. There was no anger in Mateo's voice, only confusion. That somehow made it worse. Before Caleb could answer, Elena stepped outside quietly. That's enough questions tonight. Mateo lowered his eyes immediately. Yes, Mama. She touched his shoulder gently. Go check on Sophia. The boy disappeared inside. Now only Caleb and Elena remained beneath the desert stars. Silence stretched between them while firelight danced across their faces. Then Elena finally spoke. He remembers more than I thought. Caleb nodded once. He's smart. He had to become smart. The words carried hidden pain beneath them. Caleb stared toward the darkness beyond the shock. You shouldn't stay out here alone anymore. I have survived this long. Boone won't forget what happened. Elena crossed her arms against the cold night wind. Neither will I. Caleb looked at her carefully. There it was again. The wound between them, still open after all these years. Elena? No, she whispered tiredly. Not tonight. She turned toward the house. But Caleb's voice stopped her. They said if I refused orders, innocent people would die anyway. Elena froze. The fire clicked softly between them. For a long moment neither moved. Then Caleb continued quietly. The cavalry wanted to burn villages near the border. Said locals were hiding outlaws and gun runners. His jaw tightened painfully. Women, children, families. Elena slowly faced him again. You never told me that. I couldn't. The wind rose gently through the darkness around them. Caleb stared into the flames. I refused the orders. His voice sounded distant now, like a man reliving ghosts. They arrested me that same night. Said I abandoned my post during active operations. He swallowed.
Hard. By the time I escaped military prison transport and came back, he looked toward the shock. You were gone. Elena's eyes filled slowly with emotion she had buried for years. I waited for you. I know. No, she whispered. You don't. Her voice trembled softly now, not with anger, with grief. I waited through winter storms, through raids, through sickness. Tears gathered in her eyes despite her fighting them. Every rider coming over those hills, I thought maybe it was you. Caleb lowered his head. Every word carved guilt deeper into him. Elena stepped closer to the fire. When the soldiers came asking questions about you, she whispered, people stopped helping us. They called me traitor's wife, Mexican whore. Said you ran away because of what I was. Caleb closed his eyes. The shame nearly crushed him. I never abandoned you. Elena looked at him for a very long time, and for the first time since his return, she believed him. Not completely, not enough to heal, but enough for the hatred to begin cracking apart. A sudden sound interrupted the silence. Horse hooves, far away. Both of them turned immediately toward the distant hills. Dark shapes moved briefly against moonlight. Riders, watching the shock from far across the desert ridge. Caleb stood instantly, grabbing the rifle, but the riders disappeared behind the hills moments later. The desert went silent again. Elena's voice came barely above a whisper. Boone?
Caleb kept staring into the darkness. Yes. Inside the shack, Sophia suddenly cried out softly from sleep. Elena rushed inside immediately. Caleb remained near the fire with rifle in hand, while cold wind swept through the empty desert. Hours passed slowly. The moon climbed higher above the frontier. Near midnight, Caleb sat against the porch wall, keeping watch while exhaustion pulled at him. Then the door creaked open quietly. Sophia stepped outside barefoot, holding a small blanket. Her sleepy eyes blinked against the firelight. Caleb lowered the rifle instantly. "What are you doing awake, little bird?" The girl walked toward him slowly. "I had bad dreams." Caleb softened immediately. "About what?" "The loud men in town." The answer hurt more than she realized. Sophia sat beside him carefully beneath the blanket. Children trusted kindness before they understood danger. After several quiet moments, she looked up at him innocently. "Why does Mama cry after you leave?" Caleb's breath caught. Inside the house, unseen by them both, Elena stood frozen behind the doorway curtain listening. Caleb struggled for words. Sometimes grown folks hurt each other without meaning to. Sophia thought about that seriously. "Do you hurt too?" The fire reflected in Caleb's eyes again. "Yes," he whispered. The little girl studied him carefully before placing her tiny hand against his rough fingers. The gesture was small, but it nearly broke him apart. Inside the doorway, Elena quietly covered her mouth as tears finally slipped down her face. Not because the pain was gone, but because for the first time in years, she could still see the man she once loved buried beneath all the ruin. Outside, dawn slowly began touching the horizon with pale silver light. Wind moved gently across the empty desert, while distant eagles circled over the mountains. And far away beyond those hills, unseen riders watched the lonely shack from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike.
The attack began before the sun touched the desert. A single gunshot shattered the silence of dawn. Then another. Wood exploded from the side of Elena's shack as bullets tore through the walls. Sophia screamed inside the house, while Mateo dropped to the floor beside the stove. Outside, horses shrieked in panic beneath the violent storm of gunfire. And through the darkness came the voices of men who had been paid to kill. Caleb Mercer was already awake. Years of war had trained his body to sleep lightly, and the first rifle crock sent him moving before thought could catch up. He rolled behind the water barrel outside the shack, revolver already in hand as another bullet ripped through the porch railing inches from his face. Dust burst into the cold morning air. "Inside!" Caleb shouted. Elena grabbed Sophia instantly while Mateo crawled toward the back wall. More bullets hammered the shack as lantern glass exploded across the floorboards. Outside, riders circled through the darkness like wolves. Caleb fired once. A horse screamed somewhere beyond the ridge. The gunmen scattered briefly before answering with another volley. Boone had sent professionals, not drunks, not cowards, killers. Wind roared suddenly through the desert flats, while storm clouds gathered over distant cliffs. The rising dawn painted the horizon dark red beneath drifting dust. Caleb kicked open the back door. "We ride now." Elena looked toward him sharply. "There's too many. There'll be more if we stay." Another shot tore through the doorway beside her head. Thought decided it. Within seconds, they moved through the back of the shack toward the horses hidden behind the old storage fence. Mateo climbed onto the smaller mare, while Sophia sat in front of Elena, wrapped tightly beneath her arm. Caleb handed Elena a rifle. For one brief second, she stared at it. Then she took it without hesitation. The old fear inside her was gone now. Survival had burned it away years ago. Caleb mounted his horse beside her. "Stay close to me." Elena pulled the rifle lever back with a sharp metallic click. "I stopped needing protection a long time ago." Then they rode straight into the desert. Behind them, Boone's riders gave chase immediately. The sound of pounding hooves thundered across the empty Arizona frontier, while the first light of dawn spread across the cracked earth. Dust storms rolled low through the open land, swallowing sections of the trail beneath swirling sand and heat. The chase became brutal within minutes. They crossed abandoned cavalry roads littered with broken wagon wheels and old campfires blackened by forgotten wars. Dry riverbeds cut across the land like scars, while distant mountains rose jagged beneath storm clouds. Caleb rode ahead, watching the ridges carefully. "They're trying to force us east," he shouted over the wind.
Why? Red Hollow Canyon. Elena's face tightened instantly. Even she knew the stories. Narrow cliffs, dead ends, old Apache territory where countless outlaws disappeared beneath the rocks. A trap. Gunfire exploded behind them again. One bullet struck Caleb's saddle horn, spraying splinters across his chest. Mateo cried out in fear. Elena! She twisted in the saddle immediately. 2 riders were closing fast through the dust storm. Elena raised the rifle calmly despite the violent movement of the horse beneath her. Caleb glanced back. Elena, wait! The rifle thundered. One of the riders flew sideways from his horse into the dirt. The second gunman froze in shock long enough for Caleb to finish him with a clean shot. Silence followed briefly except for pounding hooves. Caleb looked toward Elena in disbelief. She lowered the rifle slowly. My father taught me before he died, she said quietly. Then she faced forward again. Not proud, not frightened, simply prepared. Hours passed beneath merciless heat and gathering thunder. The children grew exhausted while the desert stretched endlessly around them. Dust clung to skin, lips, and lungs. Every breath tasted dry enough to bleed. By afternoon, they reached the cliffs leading toward Red Hollow Canyon. Massive stone walls rose from the earth like broken giants beneath the darkening sky. Wind screamed through the narrow passages, carrying sand and echoes deep into the canyon trails. Caleb dismounted near an old, abandoned cavalry checkpoint. Burned wagon remains still rested nearby, beside rusted cooking pans and shattered whiskey bottles left behind years earlier. He checked the canyon entrance carefully. Too quiet. Elena approached beside him. You think Boone's waiting? Caleb nodded once. He wants us trapped. Sophia whimpered weakly from exhaustion. Elena!
Knelt immediately beside her daughter, brushing dusty hair from the child's face. We're almost safe, but her own eyes carried doubt now. Thunder rolled across the canyon walls above them. Then came the sound. Slow clapping. Silas Boone stepped out from behind the rocks, accompanied by armed riders and Red Hollow's corrupt deputy sheriff. Boone smiled beneath the shadow of his white hat. Well now, he called loudly. Looks like the family reunion finally reached its ending. Caleb stepped forward instantly, revolver drawn. Boone's men raised rifles from the cliffs above. Too many. Deputy Harlan spit tobacco into the dirt beside Boone. You should have left town when you had the chance, Ranger. The canyon wind howled louder now. Dust spiraled between the stone walls while thunder cracked overhead. Boone looked toward Elena with cold amusement. You know, he said casually, your father caused all this trouble years ago. Elena frowned. What? Boone removed gloves slowly. That ranch land of yours, he said, sweetest water source in the whole valley. Caleb's expression darkened immediately. Boone continued. Cattle barons offered your father good money, but proud men don't bend easy. He smiled cruelly. So droughts got worse, loans got harder, accidents started happening. Elena stared at him in horror. You destroyed my family. Boone shrugged. Business destroyed your family. The words shattered something inside her. Every year of hunger, every insult, every buried dream, manufactured, planned, because powerful men wanted water beneath Mexican land. Mateo stepped closer to his mother while Sophia hid against her side, trembling. Caleb's voice dropped dangerously low. You used the law to steal from people. Boone laughed. No, Ranger. He looked around the canyon proudly. I used people. Then gunfire erupted. The canyon exploded into chaos. Rifles thundered from the cliffs while bullets shattered rock around them. Caleb fired toward Boone's riders as Elena pulled the children behind burned wagons for cover. Dust and smoke swallowed the canyon. A deputy charged from the rocks. Elena shot him before he reached Caleb. The man collapsed into the dirt. Caleb looked toward her briefly through the chaos. Their eyes met. No fear remained there now, only trust. A rider above the ridge aimed directly at Caleb's back. Elena saw him first. Caleb! She fired instantly. The gunman toppled from the cliff edge as thunder cracked violently overhead. Rain finally began falling across the canyon, rare desert rain, cold drops striking dust and blood alike. Boone retreated deeper between the rocks while his remaining men scattered under heavy gunfire suddenly echoing from the canyon entrance. New riders appeared through the storm, federal marshals, blue coats beneath rain-covered hats. Boone's face twisted with shock. Caleb lowered his revolver slowly. I sent evidence 3 days ago, he said quietly. Boone stared at him in disbelief. You planned this? No, Caleb answered. I prepared for it.
The marshals surrounded Boone's remaining men quickly while Deputy Harlan attempted escape through the canyon trail. Mateo pointed suddenly. "He's running!" Caleb fired one clean shot into the deputy's horse saddle. The animal collapsed sideways, throwing Harlan violently into the mud. Within minutes, it was over. The canyon fell silent except for rainfall against stone. Boone stood on his knees in the mud while federal marshals chained his hands behind his back. Still, Caleb walked toward him slowly. Every man there felt the danger in that silence. Boone looked up through blood and rainwater. "You should kill me," he muttered. Caleb stopped inches away. For a long moment, it seemed possible. After everything, the stolen years, the suffering, the children. Elena watched him carefully through the falling rain. Then Caleb slowly lowered the hammer of his revolver. "No," he said quietly. Boone frowned in confusion. Caleb's eyes remained cold and steady. "Men like you survive because everybody else becomes monsters trying to stop you." The marshals dragged Boone away through the rain, and just like that, the violence ended. Thunder rolled softer now beyond the canyon cliffs while rain washed blood into the desert earth. Elena stood motionless beside the children. Caleb walked toward her slowly through the storm. Neither spoke at first. Words no longer carried enough weight for what they had survived together. Then Sophia suddenly ran forward and wrapped her small arms around Caleb's waist. Mateo followed beside her silently. Caleb held them both carefully beneath the rain while emotion finally broke across his exhausted face. Elena watched the scene with trembling eyes, not because she needed saving, because somewhere during the gunfire, dust
and fear, they had become a family again. Above Red Hollow Canyon, storm clouds slowly parted while sunlight touched the wet desert rocks with gold. And for the first time in years, the land no longer looked cursed. The desert no longer felt like a graveyard. It breathed now. Soft winds moved across the rebuilt land outside Red Hollow, carrying the scent of wet earth left behind by rare rains. Wooden beams stood where ruins once collapsed. Fences rose again from broken posts. And in the distance, the horizon shimmered not with heat alone, but with the promise of life returning, slowly to a wounded frontier. If you're new here, subscribe to the channel and tap the bell icon. Stories like this deserve to be remembered. Weeks had passed since the canyon. Weeks since Boone's empire collapsed beneath federal chains and testimony carried through dust-covered courtrooms. Families who once whispered in fear now walked openly across reclaimed land. The valley that had once been stolen by contracts written in greed was slowly being returned piece by piece. And at the edge of it all stood a small ranch, Elena Morales' home, rebuilt not with wealth, but with survival, hands, and quiet help from neighbors who had once been too afraid to look her in the eye. The shock was gone now. In its place stood a modest wooden house with a repaired roof, a small fenced yard, and 2 horses grazing where dry earth once ruled. Smoke drifted gently from a new chimney, curling into the golden evening sky like a prayer that finally found its way upward. Inside, life was quieter, not easier, but real. Caleb Mercer stood near the porch steps, his horse already saddled behind him. The Silver Ranger badge lay on the table inside the house, returned, polished, but no longer worn with pride, only burden. Elena watched him from the doorway. The evening sun painted her face in soft amber light. The scars of exhaustion still lingered in her eyes, but something stronger lived there now, understanding, and love that had survived everything meant to destroy it. Caleb tightened the strap of his saddle slowly. "I should go," he said quietly. Elena didn't answer immediately. The wind moved between them gently, as though even the desert hesitated to break the silence. Caleb continued, "You've got peace now. Boone's gone. The land is safe. You don't need my shadow following you anymore." His voice carried guilt beneath every word, like a man still trying to pay a debt that no longer existed. Elena stepped forward onto the porch. "You think you're still a shadow here?" Caleb lowered his eyes slightly. "I know what I bring with me." "Trouble," she said softly. He nodded once. "That too." For a moment, only the wind answered them. Then Elena spoke again. "But you also brought them home." Caleb looked up immediately. Elena's gaze shifted toward the house. Inside, Mateo and Sophia played quietly near the table, their laughter softer now, no longer shaped by hunger or fear, just childhood. Caleb's voice barely carried. "They deserve better than me." Elena's expression tightened. "Stop deciding that for them." The words landed like something long held back, finally released. Caleb sat silent.
Elena stepped closer, stopping just before him. Her voice lowered. I spent years believing love was something that died when life became too cruel. She paused, then looked directly into his eyes. I was wrong. Caleb's breath caught. Elena continued, each word quieter but heavier than gunfire. I didn't stop loving you, Caleb. The wind stilled slightly. I stopped believing it could survive what we became. Silence followed. Not empty, full. Caleb looked as if he had been struck somewhere deep and unseen. Elena. But she shook her head gently. No more running. Inside the house, Sophia appeared at the doorway, small and curious. Behind her, Mateo followed. Both children looked between the adults quietly, sensing something important but not yet understanding its shape. Then Mateo spoke first. You're leaving again? Caleb turned toward him slowly. The boy's voice carried something older than his years, fear of losing what had finally returned. Caleb struggled to answer. I was trying not to make things harder. Mateo frowned slightly. That's what Mama used to say when she cried at night. Elena closed her eyes briefly. A quiet ache moved through her chest. Sophia stepped forward suddenly, small feet topping softly against the wooden porch. She walked directly to Caleb. Without hesitation, she took his hand. Caleb froze. The world around him seemed to narrow into that single moment. Sophia looked up at him. Are you staying this time? The question did not carry accusation, only hope. Caleb could not answer immediately, because
truth had finally become undeniable. He looked toward Elena. She did not speak. She only watched him, waiting, not for a promise, but for honesty. Caleb knelt slowly before the children. His voice was quiet. I never stopped trying to come back. Mateo studied him carefully, then asked the question that had been buried across years of silence. Are you our father? The wind moved again across the yard, soft, careful, as if even the desert was afraid to disturb the moment. Caleb looked at Elena one last time, and she nodded once, not fragile, not fearful, certain. Caleb turned back to the children. Yes, he said. The word did not echo. It settled. Sophia blinked slowly, as if trying to understand something too large for her small world. Then she did something simple. She stepped forward and placed Caleb's hand into Elena's. Not dramatically, not with ceremony, just with quiet certainty, as though the world had always meant for it to be there. Elena didn't pull away. Caleb didn't move. The three of them stood together beneath the fading sun. Mateo stepped closer after a moment and gently touched Caleb's sleeve. Not acceptance born from explanation, but recognition born from time finally aligning with truth. The wind softened across the ranch. Above them, the sky stretched wide and endless. Eagles circled slowly in the distance, riding warm currents above the renewed frontier. Far beyond the hills, camel traders crossed the horizon line, small silhouettes moving across the golden glow of evening, like reminders that the world kept traveling forward, no matter what was broken and rebuilt within it. Elena looked at the land around them, the ranch, the children, the man she once lost, and the life that had returned in a shape none of them expected. Her voice came softly. We don't get to forget what happened. Caleb nodded. I know, but we don't have to live inside it anymore. Caleb looked at her for a long moment, not as a ranger, not as a man haunted by orders and war, but as someone finally allowed to stand still. Then he stayed. The sun sank lower behind the desert horizon, spilling gold across the wooden porch, across the fields, across the faces of a family no longer scattered by distance or grief. Not perfect, not untouched, but together. And in that silence, the desert that once took everything finally gave something back. That was my story. If it reached you, tell me what you felt. Don't let silence bury us again. Drop your thoughts in the comments and tell me where in the world you're listening from.